Thank you so much, colleagues, for that. I think that was really, really great and wonderful. Now, I'd like us to transition to the next session. And as I call forward, I just want to introduce our moderator properly. I think she needs no introduction, by the way, but her name is Duduzile Ramela. Is an accomplished journalist. I think most of us see her on TV, and broadcaster with nearly 2 decades of experience across newsrooms, including SABC, the BBC, MoneyWeb. She currently hosts the Business of Africa podcast, where she engages high-level guests on governance, justice, climate resilience, and Africa's development. She's an experienced moderator, highly skilled at facilitating nuanced and inclusive solutions-oriented discussions. Help me welcome our moderator, Duduzile Ramela, with a round of applause, please. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gulati, sir, for the generous introduction. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's the 26th day of November 2025 already. It's been quite an eventful year. Pick something in your mind, it's already happened. And it can be very well argued that the African continent is positioned for not only incredible development, but growth. And that growth and development is up to the African continent. And I guess that is why these sessions and conferences are particularly interesting and important. When it comes to the topic of the day, or the theme rather of the conference, it must be noted that 130 meetings later, we do have a communique, as we have just heard from the previous panel, and 4 high-level priorities were identified by G20 South Africa's presidency. We're going to be tackling 3 of those priorities in this particular session, and so how the session will run is that we're going to ask our panelists to do their presentations. Each one of the panelists will have about 9 minutes to do their presentations, after which we are going to open the floor for questions and answers. Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to be calling on our panelists one by one, but for now, perhaps we should be introducing them individually. We are joined by Dr. Kennedy Manduna, Dr. Enoch Sithole, Dr. Paul Mokoki, and Dr. Siviwe Odwa Malongweni. And we'd like to firstly invite Dr. Enoch Sithole, who has to leave us at about 10:30 for another engagement, to come to the floor, please, and to give his presentation. Dr. Enoch Sithole is the Executive Director of the Institute for Climate Change Communication, also known as the ICCC, which works to raise awareness about climate change through research and training of climate activists, media and communication professionals. Dr. Sithole is a former journalism lecturer at the Wits Center for Journalism at the University of the Witwatersrand. He previously worked as a journalist and communication executive in several institutions, including the New Nation newspaper, the South African Broadcasting Corporation, and the Constitutional Assembly. He holds a PhD in climate change communication. He researches on climate change, journalism communication, and community radio. Dr. Sithole will be speaking on climate justice and climate finance, leveraging the G20 platform for Africa's sustainable future. Dr. Sithole. A round of applause, ladies and gentlemen.
Got it there, all right. No. I can just talk from here, it's fine. Thank you very much, and thank you to Dr. Wegesa and his team at ACSUS for inviting me to talk here today. Well, I had prepared a long speech because I thought I was going to have the time, but it's all fine. So I am going to talk about climate change adaptation. which I believe should be the priority for African countries. As you know, efforts to address climate change include mitigation and adaptation. I'm going to talk largely about adaptation. And the reason why I'm going to talk largely about adaptation is the fact that it is clear from a lot of research that we are set as the world to overshoot the 1.5 degrees centigrade that was discussed and agreed to in Paris in 2015, known as the Paris Agreement. We are looking set to overshoot that and perhaps reach about 2 degrees centigrade above the pre-industrial era of 1850 to 1900. I will base my discussions on a lecture given by Professor Deborah Roberts. Some of you might know her. She's a heavyweight in climate change. She teaches at the University of KwaZulu-Natal, and she's a member, or she has been for many years, a member of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. She's one of the scientists there, having chaired 2 working groups in the past 10 years. We are entering an era, as I said, in which we have exceeded or are set to exceed the 1.5 degrees set in Paris. That is viewed from the fact that the carbon budget for 2025 emissions shows a rise of 1.1%. Natural carbon sinks, forests, oceans, and oceans are weakening. There are multiple tipping points that are approaching. We can see the Amazon dieback, the Antarctic ice sheet collapse, and the Atlantic circulation that has been observed. We know that if the world average is about 2 degrees centigrade, the African average will be 3 degrees. So we are warming more than other continents. That's well known. And the result will be even more impacts of climate change in the form of droughts and devastating floods. So Professor Roberts called for what she termed radical realism in approaching climate change. As you are aware, you might be aware, Africa contributes about 3.6 degrees of global emissions. This is a 2023 total figure. That is lower than what the UK emits. UK's historical emissions are about 4%, and in 2023, they were at about 4.4%. So Africa as a whole, the whole continent, emits less than the UK or Russia. However, the impacts of climate change on African countries or on Africa as a continent is massive. We've got 90 million people facing food insecurity in Eastern and Southern Africa. We've had disasters in the form of droughts and floods, sometimes occurring simultaneously in one country. Like, for example, we saw, I think it's Kenya, where there were floods in one part of the country and drought in another part of the country. We saw in Zambia, I think last year, where the drought, the lack of rains, dried the Zambezi River, leading to a situation where there was a failure of crops in agriculture, but at the same time, there was not enough water to ensure that the power station at Kariba North Bank would continue. It didn't have enough water to continue. So it had a double problem of drought, there's no food production taking place. At the same time, there is a crisis of energy because there's no water to ensure that the power station continues to function. There are more than 10 million people that have been displaced within their countries or migrated to other countries. And you know very well the problems that migration causes. It's a problem here in South Africa. Europe is talking about it. The Americans are talking about it. So climate change is increasing the migration problem, and it's causing a lot of suffering for many people. So I suggest that there should be a scenario where adaptation to climate change is prioritized. And in that regard, I have a few recommendations that I would like to talk about, but in 9 minutes I might not be able to. But let me give you a few salient ones. There must be strengthening of adaptive governance. We know many of our countries don't have the capacity to manage or to run adaptation programs, which are very necessary in almost every African country. In South Africa, probably one of the most developed countries on the continent, our infrastructure is terrible. We saw what happened in Durban in 2022 when the drainage system couldn't cope with the floods and had the whole city inundated. Beira in Mozambique, I think it was in 2019, the whole city was underwater because the drainage system simply couldn't let the water go through to the ocean. So it's very important. We need to, governments and of course all stakeholders need to build capacity to be able to govern adaptation to climate change. Most importantly, in my view, is that there should be massive climate change awareness and communication. This November's stats from Afrobarometer suggest that climate change literacy in Africa is at 43%. In South Africa, it's 60%. But I think the sad part is that those who are literate about climate change, it's people like us, the people who are most affected in the rural areas, the women that run subsistence agriculture, are not aware of climate change. Now, how are they expected to take part in adaptation, particularly when they don't even know what we're talking about? So there is a need to increase climate change literacy on the continent so as to empower people to engage in adaptation so that they can survive the effects of climate change. I think I'll end here. I'm not sure that my 9 minutes are over, but I don't want to start something else and not finish it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sithole. Indeed, you were a little under those 9 minutes, so we do appreciate that. And thank you for the recommendations, which is strengthening of adaptive governance as well as massive climate change awareness and communication to increase literacy on climate change. Ladies and gentlemen, of course, this session is titled Geopolitics, Critical Minerals and Energy. And so our next speaker is going to be continuing on that theme that has been started by Dr. Sithole. Please do help me to welcome to the podium Dr. Siviwe Odwa Malongweni. She is a natural and applied scientist and environmental sustainability expert, holding a PhD in soil and climate sciences with over 8 years of pioneering research and practical experience. She has worked in Japan, South Africa, and other parts of the globe on soil health, biodiversity, and climate change mitigation. As the first researcher at the Center for Global Change and Special Science Envoy for Youth, she combines academic leadership with advocacy for STEM education. Her dual roles and international experience merge to create a greater impact advancing sustainable agricultural ecosystems, restoration, and Africa's role in global climate governance. Ladies and gentlemen, as we welcome Dr. Siviwe Odwa Malongweni, please do take note that we do have guests with us on the side here. We're just trying to sort out a technical issue, so please do not mind this, but we're going to continue with the program and invite Dr. Odwa Malongweni to the podium for her presentation. Dr. Malongweni, it's over to you. A round of applause, ladies and gentlemen.
Good morning, all. My name is Siviwe, and this morning I would like us all to just imagine living in a world where the once thriving ecosystems are being stripped of their natural resources, leading to a loss of biodiversity. Unfortunately, that is a reality for many regions across the African continent. Climate change is no longer a distant phenomenon, but rather a lived reality. However, hidden behind these challenged landscapes lies a powerful set of opportunities to restore and rebuild. But the big question at hand is, how do we go about doing that? Well, in today's presentation, I will be attempting to answer that very question with a particular focus on the Northern Cape province of South Africa. The outline of my presentation is as follows. The Northern Cape is considered to be one of the most climate vulnerable provinces in South Africa, with its temperatures expected to rise significantly above the national average by the year 2050. This rise in temperatures is already causing severe droughts, water scarcity, and putting strain on local communities. The strain is further exacerbated by the occurrence of invasive species that occupy nearly 20% of Northern Cape's land. The invasive species deplete our underground water and outcompete native vegetation, eventually leading to land degradation and loss of biodiversity. This is then coupled with overgrazing and poor land use, as many local communities are not equipped with the critical skills and resources that are needed in order to build resilience. According to a report from the Northern Cape local government, a single invasive prosopis plant can take about 7 liters of underground water on a daily basis. Now, imagine having a thicket with over 1,000 invasive plants. That implies that they are taking over 7,000 liters of water on a daily basis, and that needs to stop. A change needs to happen. We need to build resilience in order to prevent, mitigate, and cope with the impacts of climate change. For example, this is an image that was taken at Benfontein Nature Reserve in the Northern Cape after the occurrence of natural fire. The fire wiped out a significant portion of native flora and fauna, leading to a substantial loss of biodiversity. And the change needs to begin now in order to prevent such from happening. That change begins with a project that was implemented by the IUCN in partnership with the Department of Agriculture, Fisheries, and Forestry, alongside the Center for Global Change at Sol Plaatje University. The project is aimed at restoring degraded landscapes through the eradication of the invasive species. But upon eradication, we need to ensure that our landscapes truly recover and thrive. One way of ensuring that becomes a reality is that upon eradication, we repurpose the biomass into low-carbon, climate-adaptive buildings and other sustainable products. By doing so, we can be able to empower our economy, or at least uplift our economy, by creating job opportunities and promoting social upliftment within previously disadvantaged communities. One may wonder about the integrity or the stability of homes that are built using invasive prosopis. Will they collapse the next day, week, month, or year? Well, the structural and insulation properties of homes that were built using invasive prosopis have been put to the test, and these were the results. They performed exceptionally well, with a predicted life expectancy of over 400 years. By repurposing invasive species, we can be able to lock up atmospheric carbon dioxide and restore our landscapes, eventually reaching a net negative carbon footprint by the end of the project's life cycle, as we are diverting away from utilizing building material with high carbon footprint. The biomass can also be repurposed into multiple sustainable products, including the following. It is also very important to think about the future of the degraded landscapes upon eradicating invasive species. The focus should shift towards its ecological recovery and sustainability. For that reason, the Center for Global Change proposes that upon eradication of the invasive species, we plant native vegetation. These are trees and grasses that are native to South Africa, drought tolerant, palatable to livestock, and to some degree possess some level of nutritional or health benefits to human beings as well. A typical of such include the listed. These also have excellent phyto-mining capabilities. By utilizing such species, we can be able to prevent our native vegetation from going extinct, restore degraded landscapes, clean up contaminated sites, and allow for our water resource to start flowing again, eventually restoring our local biodiversity slowly but surely. When it comes to fire, which is a problem not only within the Northern Cape, but globally as a result of climate change, we can be able to build resilience by creating and maintaining fire breaks in order to prevent the spread of fire. We can also engage in controlled burning activities in order to manage fuel loads. We can also engage in dividing our grazing land into paddocks, in what is referred to as holistic grazing. This will allow for our landscapes to rest and recover. Whilst doing this, it is crucial that we also monitor changes in our vegetation and biodiversity in order to guide adaptive management. Within Benfontein Nature Reserve in the Northern Cape, this can be achieved through the utilization of flux tower data. And this is one of the many projects that I'm currently running, being funded by the NRF under the following title. All these approaches are being proposed by, as well as being implemented by the Center for Global Change. They are in line with the global sustainability efforts and support the following SDGs. The Center for Global Change is amplifying African voices by ensuring that it provides mentorship, training, and certification to local communities in order to strengthen their resilience to climate change. With all that being said, I would like to conclude by stating that at the Center for Global Change, we fully understand that it is very crucial that we take care of our planet so that our planet can be able to take care of us. Within the Northern Cape, this begins with eradicating invasive species and repurposing them into resources that strengthen our resilience. Thank you very much for your time and attention on this matter. You're more than welcome to ask questions. You can also reach out to me if you would like to engage on this further. These are my details. Thank you.
A big thank you and a round of applause, ladies and gentlemen, once again for Dr. Siviwe Odwa Malongweni. Two words that have indeed stuck: resilience and restoration. And we speak about sustainability quite a lot. And what does sustainability mean? I once asked somebody that exact question: what does sustainability mean? And they said that it is planting a tree knowing that you will not enjoy the shade of that tree tomorrow, but it will be enjoyed by those who are coming after you. So it is not only about us, but those who do come after us. We continue with this theme and invite Dr. Paul Mokoki. He's a finance manager in the Advancement Division of the University of the Witwatersrand. Are we all awake? I guess that was a test. Testing. Yes, we are. His research interests include climate finance, infrastructure financing, bond market development, and sustainable finance. He holds a PhD in development finance. Dr. Mokoki will be speaking on climate justice and climate finance, leveraging the G20 platform for Africa's sustainable future. A round of applause, ladies and gentlemen.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Yes, indeed, my topic is on climate justice and climate finance, and it's focusing on leveraging the G20 for Africa's sustainable future. As you know, the G20 South African Summit has come and has gone. So what I will do today is just to unpack the climate justice outcome of the Johannesburg G20 Summit, and which was the first G20 to be held on the African soil. And I will explain these decisions, how these decisions will shape the future of climate finance. You are aware that after the summit, there was a declaration that was produced. That was the Leaders' Declaration Summit. And yes, which one? Okay. Yeah, so I am going to unpack this and see whether Africa achieved something from this G20. So I want to start beginning with the problem. The central problem that we have is the climate justice. And what is it about? You would know that at the Johannesburg Declaration, they acknowledged that there is the gap of justice gap is very wide. And in particular, they noted that we are deeply alarmed that 2 million Africans lose their lives each year due to the absence of clean cooking fuel. For example, this was outlined in the paragraph 23, but let's look at the statistics. Africa emissions, 4% of global total, but yet we face 50 billion per annum of adaptation costs That's where the issue of justice come into. Those that cause little to global pollution are the ones that are suffering much than those that caused. And we also note that Africans without electricity, 600 million, and this is almost 40% access rate, which is the lowest in all the world. Africans also without cooking facilities is 1 billion. That is almost 78% of the 1.3 billion of Africans. And people that die from air pollution, from cooking, are almost estimated to be annually 2 million. And yet, the climate finance gap continue to widen. So, one of the most important outcome of this declaration was that it embraced the concept of the philosophy of Ubuntu. I am because you are. This reframes that climate justice is a shared global responsibility and it's not charity. Okay, now what was my research question? Although when I started this research a long time ago, the research questions were slightly different, but now I've decided to rephrase it slightly to say, how has Africa exerted influence within the G20 to shape the more equitable global climate finance architecture? And for me to do that, I looked at particularly also on this G20 Leaders Declaration, which was just published after the summit, and I also looked at other documents that has to do with the climate finance, especially looked at some of the case studies. So, in that, I noted that also, you will note that the developing countries require up to almost 6 trillion of finance or climate finance before 2030 to meet their climate commitments. And this is where Africa entered in the dialogue with the G20. Okay, what were my findings? My first findings was that Africa leadership has now moved from appeal to negotiated outcomes. Previously, it appears Africans would go to these international forums to plead and to beg for help. But from this G20, you see them confidently now being part of the solution. And in these solutions, they came up with what we call the Loss and Damage Fund, which was operationalized in COP27 in 2020 in Egypt. And this is a framework which they put together monies to address those countries that have already impacted or affected by the climate change. We also, again, found that at this summit, the leaders recognize the urgent need for action for this loss and damage. And we also noted the Nairobi Declaration came into effect and being a platform where the African leaders speak with one voice. And another very important outcome, as I have mentioned, is the Ubuntu philosophy, which was officially adopted by the G20 declaration. So what we found is that Africa became the agenda setter instead of just receiving the agendas from them. And in that, they also came up with African-informed frameworks on disaster resilience, early warning systems. The other important framework that was adopted and that is going to get the support that we require is the Mission 300. And this Mission 300 is that framework where Africans have decided that they would want to connect 300 million Africans to electricity by 2030 and also provide clean cooking infrastructure. And also, very important, I think my colleague is going to talk about it, it's about the critical minerals framework that explicitly prioritizes local beneficiation at source. That was was outlined in paragraphs 31 to 34, almost four paragraphs that they dedicated on critical minerals at the summit. So my second finding was on Africa's climate finance innovations that were not only recognized, but they were also endorsed at the G20 level. So one of them is the debt for climate mechanism. So what this means is that Africa came up with a framework where they said the debt is quite unsustainable among us as African countries, but we are also expected to address issues of climate change, which we did not cause anyway. So what they were saying, they came up with a framework and said, give us what we call debt for climate swaps on a voluntary basis. So what what Africa decided to say is, if we have got debt with a certain country, we will agree and voluntarily say, okay, forgive us that debt, but those savings, we will channel them to environment. And this initiative was endorsed and accepted. Then the other innovation which Africa created was the blended finance architecture, which blended finance is that you want now to come up with government brings in their capital and in order that they will attract private finance by thereby de-risking, the environment and also doing what we call risk sharing. And this brings about a lot of investment, say like in renewable energy, because they feel that the risk will be too much for the private sector, so the government has to come in as well and contribute. So the other initiative was that they managed was the DSR, which means the special drawing rights, which was facilitated, which was negotiated and was raised about $100 billion through IMF, and this will expand liquidity. Instead of borrowing, if they have a crisis of climate change crisis, what African countries might do is just to go to IMF and to see, can we get this money so that we can also address our situation in our countries, And this was a very innovative way of trying to get leverage from the G20 platform. So now, when we find now, Africa finds that G20 found Africa as found G20 as an arena for most of its to push through its strategic agendas, and one of them was why it was important that they had to get a seat there was because G20 consists of 80% people, countries with 80% of the GDP, and the 75% of emissions are caused by countries in the G20, and the bulk of the climate finance comes from there. So Africa got that influence, got the seat, and one of the other leverage that Africa brought in there was the critical minerals. So, which now formally recognize that Africa can beneficiate its own minerals at source, and also that Africa will also, since I've said Africa holds a seat there, it has managed also to negotiate in the IMF 25th board chair and also come up with the African engagement framework in which Africa decided to come up with a methodology and strategy of how they are going to take forward these gains through the other G20s that are going to go ahead, like in the USA, and thereafter I think the next one is in, I can't remember, but it's, the next one is in the USA. And I remember the president of South Africa decided that South Africa will lead that framework until 2030. Okay, I'm now said to be, okay, now in closing. So, okay, this closing now. So what I'm saying, what is very important now that the G20 has come and gone. So what are the imperatives that we need? We need commitment to implementation. What we want, we require now action from African Union to coordinate these initiatives and take them through to USA in 2026, 27, and also in South Korea in 2028. We have also to continuously to leverage on our minerals, and our action is for Africa's continental, to have a continental strategy that is embedded in African free trade, to link it in such that we can get value from our minerals. We also need to continue to coordinate to coordinate African countries as a bloc, not as a single, to influence these multi-development banks so that they can hear us and they can understand our concern. And we want to continue to monitor this gap that is there of 6 trillion. And I think we also want to implement that just energy transition and see a way how we can accelerate it with the help of the G20. Thank you.
A big thank you to Dr. Paul Mokoki, and you rightfully mentioned we need commitment to implementation now that all has been said and done. You touch on critical minerals, which are also in the communique of the G20 leaders. We're going to be inviting now to expand on that theme Dr. Kennedy Manduna. He is a postdoctoral fellow at UNISA. He's also affiliated, with ACSUS. Previously, he worked with the International Research Group on Authoritarianism and Counter Strategies of the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation and the University of the Witwatersrand. He's also a visiting scholar at the Otto Suhr Institute of Political Science at Freie Universität in Berlin, Germany, and he is going to be speaking on African countries needing to leverage South Africa's G20 presidency in critical mineral managing to assert African agency, extractive imperialism, geopolitics, and resource nationalism. A round of applause, ladies and gentlemen, for Dr. Manduna.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Kenny Manduna, and I'll be speaking on this very important topic of the day. But I just want to start with a very big anecdote to say most of what we call critical minerals are not energy transition minerals. And most of what we call energy transition minerals are also not critical minerals. I know it's a very controversial charge, but I will explain it. What do I mean by that? The criticality of critical minerals, or the criticality of what we are calling critical minerals, depends on very contested grounds. As to say, you go to countries like Botswana, their critical or their most important mineral is not lithium, it's diamond, right? And you go to some other countries, say maybe go to Zimbabwe, diamond, gold, but they are not listed in what they want to call critical minerals. So when we are now at a point where we are undergoing some geopolitical, some geoengineering, some geostrategic like tensions, where we are finding out the US imperialism or its hegemony is now at stake. We are now asking the question, where is an African? How can we assert African agents? Or what is it that we have as a leverage to assert African agents? So what we could find out is we have the geological bound in the continent. And most of the geological bound is in what they are listing as critical minerals, or what our African Union calls the green minerals, which I would want also to go with it, because once you call them critical minerals, it would look like we are all calling that list critical minerals in the continent, of which we are not doing that. So the question now is, as Africa has been designated as the biggest deposit of these minerals, is it just transition we are finding out, or it is just extraction? And another question, the most important one, who tends to gain and to lose from this mega extraction of African critical minerals? So that's the question I'm trying to answer, and how can we also leverage on that? So what we are finding out a new scramble for these minerals in the continent. The only difference now we are finding out is any African now is now at the table. We are now seeing a lot of our leaders, they are now flocking to many other countries. You see, if there is a FOCAC in Japan, you see them going, like in China rather, TICAD in Japan, almost everywhere they are going, but what are they discussing about? They are discussing issues they have leverage on. But now the question, who stands to gain, who stands to benefit? Are we seeing the African agent being exerted or being asserted? Are we seeing like African renaissance being also amplified, or it is something else different? So from the Chinese perspective, what we are seeing an amplified or huge investment of the Chinese government and also private capital in our mining sector. So for example, you go to Tanzania and Burundi, we are finding out 2.1 billion railway construction. You go to Zimbabwe, our 4 biggest lithium companies, most of them, they are owned by the Chinese. You go to Zambia via Tanzania, the Tazara railway line, Zambia and DRC, we are also finding out like huge chunks of money from the Chinese government and also like private sector. Mozambique, you go also like to Namibia. Then we are also on the other end finding out the the Western strategic partnerships. But if we are to look at it, they are coming as individual countries and also as a collective. You could see, for example, in the case of the US-EU partnership coming to Zambia, the DRC, and some other Central African countries which are rich in minerals. Or else it can come like only like as US. We have seen US brokering a peace agreement between Rwanda and DRC. But for what purpose? We all know that. We are also seeing green hydrogen investment in South Africa and also in Namibia, Lobito corridor as well. We are also seeing the refurbishment of the Nakala corridor from Malawi to Beira. All these ones, you tend to ask yourself to say, so are we seeing a change when it comes to extractive imperialism? What are the legal frameworks from outside like the continent, which have got a huge impact in the extraction of our minerals, in the processing and exploitation of our minerals? So you go to the EU, they've got a collective, the Net Zero Industry Act 2023. For what? To scale up the manufacturing of clean technologies. But where are the source countries of these minerals? This side. US Inflation Reduction Act, EU Green Deal Industrial Plan for Net Zero Age, EU Critical Materials Act. So what we are seeing is the out of the continent superpowers, they are so coordinated, they are so well organized when it comes to say, how are we going to extract and benefit from these minerals? But from the continent now, are we also as well organized, as planned, and as oiled machine as the out of the continent superpowers? So as to what? To assert the African agent. So as to see an African not being a room, like a room taker, but also a what? A room maker. I just want you to see these routes which are being refurbished. On your left, you are seeing the Lobito corridor. From Zambia via DRC to the port of Lobito in what? In Angola. The question is, for what reason? You could see it's from our raw materials or our raw minerals extracted from the African Copper Belt region, that is Zambia, DRC, and other countries, then accessed by the route via either Europe or via America. On the other end, you are seeing the Tazara corridor. It's now via Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, from Zambia, going to China. On the other one, you are also seeing the Nakala corridor, from Malawi to the port of Nakala in Mozambique. But the question is, are we seeing this infrastructure pointing to African development or pointing to something else which we can call modern extractive imperialism at the moment? So my question I'm keeping on asking is, where is African agents? You go to the DRC war, which they have said like America has managed to broker a peace agreement. Multiple UN reports, they've accused Rwanda, of course, of using conflict as a way of looting like Congolese minerals. But for what purpose? We all know. In recent years as well, the M23, they've also benefited from the lucrative mining areas like in the Eastern Congo. So for me now, what are the recommendations or the proposed way forward? For us now to say, if we are to do the following, we will assert African agency. If we are to do the following, we will make sure that an African is no longer just under the table or at the table just like as a passive actor. So we want to see technology transfer as non-negotiable, equity transfer as well. We also want to see our geological bound being used as a negotiating power. To say, because we have got the minerals you want, we might not know how to turn them into batteries or etc., but we also want that. Then we also want to see establishment of many sovereign wealth funds in the continent. And also critical minerals fund, specifically to say every country with critical minerals must establish this one. And protocols and standards around the provenance, traceability and accountability of these minerals, we also want to see that, so that we can be able to trace. Establishment of regional clusters for shared industrialization and development, they are also critical in the continent. One other critical recommendation I would also want to put across, I know my time is also over, to adopt the Indonesian model. Indonesia told China to say, if you want our nickel, you need to do one thing. You beneficiate, you valuate your minerals here in Indonesia. Why are we not doing the same thing in the continent? How are we also going to also stop the thing of from the port to the pit or from the mine to the market, not necessarily like to industrialize? So these are the recommendations I would also say. If we are to take them seriously, we are also going to find an African at the table contributing like anyone else, and also making ourselves as a part of the rulemaking, not only like rule takers. Thank you very much.
A big thank you to Dr. Kennedy Manduna. And Dr. Manduna, you asked the question of whether we are organizing as a continent. Some may very well argue that there is organization that is happening. Is it happening coherently, or is it happening in silos? Maybe that is something that the audience also will help us to understand. At this particular moment, we're going to be opening the floor for questions. We're going to be taking a couple of rounds. We'll note you. The mic will come to you, and please pose your questions. Say who the question is directed to as well, please. There's a couple of questions here at the front. 4 we see. We'll take the first 4 and come back for the second round.
Thank you. Thank you so much, colleagues, for your wonderful presentations. Again, my name is Kabaso from the African Center for the Study of the US. I think we could almost claim that South Africa is leading the continent in the so-called just energy transition. There's a lot of funding that has been poured into this. And my simple question is, with all the international climate finance that's flowing into South Africa for the just energy transition, from your reading, from your experience, can you share what mechanisms are in place to ensure that this funding is actually going to the intended beneficiaries? Enoch, you mentioned that some of the most affected are at the bottom. Just how just, basically, is this transition? How much of that funding is reaching where it should go? Thank you.
Thanks, Kabaso. My name is Irina Murison from, I'm a postdoc at UNISA, and so what I wanted to ask the panel at large is, what happens to the people who talk about climate change with a different lexicon? So I've heard of studies where a lot of people in poor or disadvantaged communities are able to track climate change as well, but do refer to it in a different form of grammar structures, different lexicons, and that. What happens to their opinions? Is it counted? How would you like to engage it? And then to my colleague, Dr. Manduna, when we look to the just economic transition, right, and you had a number of fantastic policies that were flagging, I would like to get your understanding of, and also with Kabaso's intervention, when something like the JET IP comes into the, let's say, when it's localized, there's an anticipation that you're going to have quite a bit of business engagement into it, because when you procure technologies, it comes from a business side. So how far, and I really appreciated how much of it you're able to point out geographically, but how far can we consider this at a local scale? I'm sorry, I know it's probably a bit of a word soup there, but have you considered the business transaction side of things? Thanks.
Hi, Sanusha again. I was fascinated by Kennedy's example of Indonesia and how they managed to get China to